So with these notes, we are going to finish up questions 4 and 5 in section 3, looking at the topic of prohibition. So now we're going to talk about kind of some of the fun or interesting stuff of prohibition, which is how it changed society. So for the first bullet, we're going to write organized crime greatly increased because of, and then on the screen there in the bottom left, bootlegging, speakeasies, and racketeering. Bootlegging, speakeasies, and racketeering, semicolon. So those things are basically crimes of importing and selling alcohol illegally and then making money off of it. And so because of that, we see organized crime start to rise during this time period because they were really the ones that were bringing in the illegal alcohol. And one of the most famous of the gangsters of this time, due to Prohibition, is Al Capone. So after the semicolon, we want to write gangsters like Al Capone, and his name is on the screen there for you. Gangsters like Al Capone began to dominate city politics. Semicolon. So we started to see these gangsters get very involved with both paying off a lot of public officials and police officers and people to kind of look the other way because they were bringing in alcohol. And more or less, as you'll see from some of the clips and things I show you, that a lot of times those were the individuals who were just as heavily involved in consuming alcohols was the ones who were writing the prohibition laws themselves and enforcing those laws. And then after the semicolon, we want to write gangsters smuggled alcohol in from neighboring areas or across international borders. So there are many stories from this time period of ways that people got away with smuggling in illegal alcohol and transporting it during the time. If you look at the pictures there's two examples. The one in the upper left-hand corner was a truck that was supposed to look like a brick truck, but it actually was hollow in the middle. And what they would do is they would fill the inside with, alcohol and be able to drive carefree throughout the city without people suspecting that there was actually booze inside. So it was kind of, tricks like that would be commonplace to get alcohol around cities and to speakeasies and things like that. Other stories that I've read have said, especially up in areas of like Michigan and Chicago and Detroit and places like that, that sometimes during Prohibition, they would drive across Lake Michigan in the wintertime when it was frozen to get to Canada because it was really only a few miles. And so when the lake was frozen, you could drive across and they would go in and they would buy alcohol because it wasn't illegal there. And then they'd turn around and drive back all in the cover of darkness of the night. And that was a way to get alcohol back and forth. But sometimes what would happen is you'd find a patch in the ice that wasn't so frozen and the trucks would go through, like what happened here in this picture. So there's all kinds of interesting stories of ways that people would try and get alcohol in and out and around town without people realizing. So it's kind of a very interesting story and lore that exists as a result of that. So bootlegging And bringing this alcohol around was definitely a component of that. I'm going to play you a video clip that demonstrates what was happening with bootlegging in our nation's capital.
Dad wasn't the smartest man in the world, but he wasn't the dumbest one either. As soon as he got into the bootlegging business, the first thing he bought was a brand new Cadillac. Real big Cadillac touring car. Boy, that was fancy thinking. We were rolling around through Washington like we owned the place. As a kid, I just assumed this was everybody was doing this. But Dad said, don't ever ask anybody, because they're going to ask you what I do. And it's nobody's business. I said, okay. I just assumed, that this was a way of life for everybody back then.
Donald Ward's father, Paul, had once worked in a mill that manufactured the special paper used by the Treasury Department to print dollar bills. But when Prohibition went into effect, he discovered a more direct way of making money. He often took his son with him when he made deliveries.
Got a suitcase with him, carried 6 quart jars of booze in there. The biggest place that we went into was right in the capital of the United States, believe it or not. I was surprised, much as anybody else would be. But we went in under the front steps, take an elevator, go up 1 or 2 floors, and go either to the right-hand side, which was the Senate office, or to the left-hand side, which was the House office. He'd go in the anteroom. He'd be gone 10, 15 minutes, come out. He said, let's go. Get in the car, drive on down East Capitol Street. Then he'd pull over the curb and he'd take out an envelope out of his pocket and he'd start counting money. And I mean, he was counting money. $100 bills is what it was. Right in there, these congressmen. They're passing the law, but they're still buying the booze from the bootleggers.
All right, so that kind of demonstrates how these laws were passed, but if you're not enforcing the law, it makes it very hard to kind of carry it out. And in some instances, some of the biggest people that were buying this illegal alcohol were the people that were making the laws in the first place. So just kind of interesting techniques and stories that man had to share about his experiences. So on top of bootlegging, sometimes people would manufacture their own alcohol. So this is the second bullet. Many citizens began to produce alcohol in their own homes and sell it on the black market. So we've talked about before how many of you have mentioned the idea of like moonshiners, and that was something that kind of picked up in popularity during this time, because originally moonshine was something that started in kind of more rural areas where they couldn't more readily get alcohol, so you would make your own. And a lot of times it was in high alcohol content by volume, and had very strong effects on those who were drinking it. Well, people started to kind of take this idea and make their own alcohol. So moonshining was obviously something that gained in popularity, as well as people making alcohol in their own homes. Like very famously, people would make what was called bathtub gin, which if you look at the picture there in the bottom right, is actually a scene from an old movie where they're making bathtub gin, and you would basically kind of distill your own alcohol in the bathtub and then take it out and bottle it yourself, and you could sell it to other people or keep it for yourself and slowly drink it, whichever. But that was kind of the reality, is people found ways to kind of make their own alcohol, or if let's say you couldn't make your own alcohol, you could try and go to the popular bars that were hidden that had alcohol called speakeasies. So this is the third bullet. Speakeasies became popular hangouts. Speakeasies became popular hangouts for those who wanted to consume alcohol, for those who wanted to consume alcohol, semicolon. They were hidden, comma, underground bars, hidden, comma, underground bars that were frequented by gangsters and flappers. And flappers is Flappers. And so these speakeasies were places where you could go and get alcohol, and they were kind of hidden, so it added to the allure of them. They might be, you'd turn down a dark alley and go to a back door and knock, and someone would be there, asking for a password. And you'd tell them the password and they let you in. Sometimes they were even more elaborate than that, where there would be a legitimate business, running in the front during the day, and then you'd walk into the business in the evening hours and there'd be a door in the back that you would go through there as well. Or, I've heard stories of people sliding bookcases and going downstairs and being a speakeasy, down in this underground basement, all kinds of different things. But they became really kind of popular places because of the allure that this illegal activity was happening there. And they would have jazz music and all the latest fashions, and it just became a popular place for especially the gangsters of the time, who were a lot of times the ones who were paying for the speakeasies and making the money from the people coming there to buy the alcohol. So they were frequented by the gangsters, and then also flappers, which flappers was a nickname for women of the time who were kind of going through a both cultural and sexual revolution. And what I mean by that is women in the Victorian time period, the time prior to that, all wore very long skirts and, had their long hair pulled back and were very, kind of matronly and well-mannered. And now we have the culture of the flapper, and the flappers wearing high heels and short skirts, and a lot of times cut their hair very short, and were drinking and smoking and doing all these things with men that would be considered somewhat promiscuous. So it was kind of this new culture where women started to say, hey, I can hang out and kind of play with the boys a little bit, and it just kind of added to the excitement of that time and this new kind of culture and sexual revolution of women, on top of the fact, which we're going to talk about later, the women's suffrage movement, which was occurring at the same time period. So women were kind of becoming more equal to men and experiencing those new freedoms. So I'm going to play you a clip that talks about them kind of finding this new identity and excitement of the time.
A man might as well do his drink
because the saloon was a male-only institution. But the speakeasy, where there was no law enforced of any kind, became different. And if you have a little jazz band and somebody's, like the Charleston, you're going to have women and men together. There's a real liberation for women and liberation of behavior that takes place then. An independence that said, he can drink, I can drink too. And that wouldn't have happened before Prohibition.
I went to Radcliffe, and there was Harvard was right beside, and the boys at Harvard were always making bathtub gin, and having people for drinks. I was somewhat in awe of some of the college men that I knew. They were so grown up. They were juniors and seniors. I sort of went along with it. I didn't drink much, but I did drink some. And I thought it was quite good. It made you feel nice and cheerful.
There's a liberation here that the young, urban, modern woman could jump into and really go crazy. whether it was wild dancing or wild sex, or really the sense of no one's going to tell me what I can or can't do. Women were suddenly behaving in very different ways in the 1920s. It's not a complete turn overnight. In some ways, this is a gradual build-up from the beginning of the 20th century. But then in the 1920s, it seems to really take off.
And the rest of the game in open spaces where men are men. A chicken never waits till she's a hen. Don't keep me waiting, for I do vow you'll do it someday. So why not now?
I did realize that there was a fast set and that you had to be prepared for how you were going to answer questions. It was the beginning of the time when boys and girls slept together. There was quite a lot of that going on, which astounded me from my innocent background. But anyway, it was happening a lot, really. My girlfriends told me, and would ask, did I have a really good boyfriend or not? But I always denied it.
The older generation of women who had fought so hard to win the vote and to bring about prohibition were more and more appalled at the wanton behavior of their daughters.
There would have been a sexual revolution in the 1920s without the role of alcohol, but because the two were happening together, folks who were active in the temperance and suffrage movements came to zero in on liquor as an engine of this new sexual revolution.
Don't keep me waiting, for I do vow you'll do it someday. So why not now?
We tend to think ahistorically, so we imagine that our generation invented sex, or that it invented drinking, or even that it invented drug use. If you look at the movies of the 1920s, for instance, Flaming Youth, the Colleen Moore movie, which was arguably the first flapper movie, it portrays a tremendous amount of sex and a tremendous amount of drinking. There's even a very scandalous scene that's seen behind a silhouette in which all of the teenagers are jumping into a pool unclothed.
If you're in Omaha or you're in Cleveland or wherever it might be, and you see the young, glamorous Joan Crawford drunk and dancing on a tabletop in Our Dancing Daughters, well, gee, that's the life of the exciting people in the big cities, so it spreads. And you find that as the country becomes more homogenized through mass media, one of the things that's getting homogenized is its drinking habits.
Let's misbehave.
In Hollywood and on the Broadway stage, in magazines and newspapers, and countless songs turned out by Tin Pan Alley,
Let's misbehave.
illegal alcohol, with its hint of illicit sex, had come to be seen as a sign of glamour and sophistication, something to be sought after, not shunned.
It's part of the conspicuous consumption of the 1920s, where the amount you spent and what you got and the brand and the label and everything became, it became that much more important to people. It's a status symbol. It's kind of strange to think of something so illegal being such a status symbol. You were what you drank.
Let's misbehave.
All right, so that kind of gives you an idea of how this time period for many people was a time period, especially women, of kind of rebirth and a new way of looking at the world. And some say alcohol fueled that, and others say that it was just kind of a component of the culture of the time, and that this sexual revolution would have came about anyway. But that's also something kind of interesting of the time. The last change of society is that cities, so this is the last bullet, cities also became battlegrounds for competing gangsters, which made cities more dangerous. So during this time, gangsters like Al Capone and the other gangs of that time period, for example, Irish gangs were taking off at that time as well. To some degree, some Russian gangs, but more so it was really a divide between the Italian gangs like Al Capone's and the Irish gangs were battling over their territory and their alcohol and the things that were occurring. And so we start to see this violence that was oftentimes erupting right there in the streets. So not only was the Bureau of Prohibition dealing with enforcing this law, they were also dealing with the crime and the gangsters who were causing issues and problems as well. So this violence was actually spurred on more so by the event. So talk about before when we said that violence was one of the reasons they wanted to have prohibition. Well, now even more violence is erupting because of prohibition. So I'm going to play you a clip about Al Capone and his beer wars.
Some call it bootlegging, some call it racketeering. I call it a business. They say I violate the prohibition law. Who doesn't? All I ever did was sell beer and whiskey to our best people. All I ever did was to supply a demand that was pretty popular. Why, the very guys that made my trade good are the ones that yell loudest at me. Some of the leading judges use the stuff. They talk about me not being on the legitimate. Nobody's on the legit. Al Capone.
Capone becomes really famous for the first time in the summer of 1926. It's after the murder of Billy McSwiggan, a prosecutor. And this is a crime that really outrages everybody. I mean, it gets national publicity, and Capone is the first person blamed for it. He hides out for a while, and he comes back to town and says, I'll answer all the questions you've got. I didn't do it. Billy McSwiggan was a friend of mine. In fact, I was paying him. He was on my payroll, as if that explains everything.
Al Capone, the big-time Chicago bootlegger and gangster, had not wanted the prosecutor killed. His triggermen were trying to hit the mobsters walking next to McSwiggan, who had gone to school with him. 2 of them had also died. Capone was never charged. The peace among the city's various ethnic neighborhood gangs Capone and his mentor Johnny Torrio had carefully negotiated back in 1921 had not lasted very long. The big profits to be made from hijacking each other's shipments of beer and liquor proved too tempting.
So all the gangsters who had their own neighborhoods in Chicago started vying for the work in their territories. Well, the strong won out, and they ended up with the district. And the weak ended up in the cemetery.
Dion O'Banion, the head of one gang, became worried that the Italians, including Capone and Torrio, were conspiring against the Irish and decided to double-cross them. When O'Banion learned that the police were planning to raid his biggest illegal brewery, he kept it to himself and told Torrio and Capone he wanted out of the business and was willing to sell it to them for $500,000. When Torrio arrived to take possession, the police descended and arrested him and a number of his men. O'Banion's head, Capone said, got away from his hat. A few months later, as O'Banion was working in his flower shop, 2 gunmen shot him dead. Capone denied any connection to that crime, too, and sent a huge bouquet to the funeral. But O'Banion's henchmen, Jaime Weiss and George Bugs Moran, swore vengeance. The Chicago Beer Wars had begun. When someone shot up Capone's car, he ordered himself a 7-ton bulletproof Cadillac. Weiss and Moran then shot Johnny Torrio as he returned from shopping with his wife. Torrio was hit 5 times. He somehow survived, but soon thereafter decided he'd had enough and went home to New York. Al Capone inherited all of Torrio's Chicago operations and moved to consolidate his hold on the beer business.
As Capone starts to seek more power, there's a great shakeup in the hierarchy. This sets off a huge gang war, and the public begins to see shootouts on Michigan Avenue, and suddenly it's like Dodge City here. Newspapers every day screaming with headlines. Bullets flying, cars driving by, and light of the machine gun flashing from the window. And suddenly he's in the spotlight. He seems to like the spotlight.
I don't want trouble. I don't want bloodshed, but I'm going to protect myself. When somebody strikes at me, I'm going to strike back. I'm the boss.
In September of 1926, Jaime Weiss led a deadly convoy of 11 sedans through the suburb of Cicero, firing more than 1,000 rounds into Capone's headquarters there and hitting several innocent passers-by. Capone was unhurt. No one was arrested. 3 weeks later, in broad daylight, in front of Holy Name Cathedral in downtown Chicago, Capone's men machine-gunned Weiss to death and wounded 3 of his lieutenants. Again, no one dared make an arrest. 76 mobsters would be shot or stabbed or bludgeoned to death in Chicago by the end of 1926. 54 more would die in 1927. I don't want to encourage the business, the chief of police told a reporter. But if somebody has to be killed, it's a good thing the gangsters are murdering themselves. It saves trouble for the police. Jurors and judges and prosecutors were paid off. Gang members refused to talk. Intimidated witnesses developed what was called Chicago amnesia. None of the killers was ever sent to jail. The city today, wrote the Literary Digest, symbolizes murder galore and crime unpunished. One senator demanded that President Coolidge withdraw U.S. Marines from Nicaragua and send them to Chicago. The New York mobster Lucky Luciano visited the city and pronounced it a real goddamn crazy place. Nobody's safe in the street.
For just a couple of years there, 26 and 27, it almost lives up to the hype, these incredible violent acts. It's Capone's doing. It's his quest for power.
With most of his enemies dead or driven out of town, Capone decided it was time to call for a truce in the beer wars.
We're making a shooting gallery out of a great business, and nobody's profiting by it. It's hard and dangerous work. And when a fellow works hard at any line of business, he wants to go home and forget it. He doesn't want to be afraid to sit near a window or open a door. There's plenty of beer business for everybody. Why kill each other over it?
Everything seemed to be going Capone's way. In 1927, his old ally, the Republican ex-mayor Big Bill Thompson, decided to run again, promising an end to police raids that seemed only to affect thirsty working people and leave the big shots untouched. When I'm elected, we will not only reopen places these people have closed, Thompson promised, but we'll open 10,000 new ones. No copper will invade your home and fan your mattress for a hip flask. Capone gave Thompson an estimated $250,000 to run his campaign. The Republican won by a landslide. Capone hung a portrait of Thompson between images of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln on his office wall. He could now afford to be magnanimous about law enforcement. I got nothing against the honest cop on the beat, he explained. You just have them transferred someplace where they can't do you any harm.
There's no real reason why he should become the most famous gangster in American history. He's not that different from dozens, maybe hundreds of others who are doing the same kind of criminal activity. I think the key difference is that he liked attention. He was the first media hound, the first publicity addict among the great gangsters, and he invited the newspaper reporters for interviews.
Most gangsters did their best to stay out of sight. Al Capone held press conferences at which he presented himself as what he called a public benefactor who offered Chicago citizens the light pleasures they wanted. When I sell liquor, it's bootlegging, he said. When my patrons serve it on a silver tray on Lakeshore Drive, it's hospitality.
He got to be very popular because he was one of the few gangsters that spent money. The rest of them threw half dollars around like they were sewer covers. Capone gave everybody money, including the newspaper reporters. Capone's idea was that everybody reads the newspapers, and most people are stupid enough to believe what's written in the newspapers.
There was a great media war underway at the time. Hearst was expanding to Chicago and other cities, and he was doing it by making his papers splashier than the others. And the newspaper writers who discovered these gangsters were rewarded. They became stars of their newspapers because these were great stories that people couldn't get enough of. He felt like by elevating himself in this way, by making himself famous in the way that Babe Ruth was more than a baseball player, but he was a celebrity. In making himself famous in that way, he would somehow rise above the muck and make himself into a public figure, and he might be accepted that way, that he might have a better chance of operating in the long run as this prohibition businessman.
Capone became one of the best-known Americans on earth. He signed autographs at Cubs and White Sox games, played Santa Claus at a nearby parochial school, and gave away $100,000 worth of baubles every Christmas. School children ran after his limousine as it slid through the streets. 18 bodyguards surrounded him when he turned up at the fights, or the opera, or the racetrack. Tour buses rolled past the Metropole Hotel, his new Chicago headquarters, where he had rented 2 floors and 50 rooms from which to run a growing empire of prostitution and gambling, racketeering, and his biggest source of money, booze. Newspaper readers couldn't get enough of Al Capone.
I think in the middle of Capone's reign, it's a very complicated relationship that the public has. It's not that he's a bad guy, that he's a super villain. They see him as a human being who happens to be in this illegal racket, but it's also a racket that nobody really supports prohibition, so they can't really hate Capone too much. And for the most part, there's never a clear murder that you can pin on him. So people at least have this feeling that maybe he's above it all somehow. And of course, he's got a piece of everything at this point. Not a lot of businesses in Chicago are not in some way connected to Capone. You know, every delivery driver, every dry cleaning business is connected to Capone. He's everywhere now. His tentacles are reaching everywhere.
As Capone diversified, he nonetheless cautioned everyone against investing in the booming stock market. It's a racket, he said.
My dad ran 2 very large hotels in Chicago. Principal one was the Stevens Hotel. They were successful in persuading the Canners Convention to come to Chicago. He and the manager of another hotel in Chicago thought it was very important that there not be an awful lot of crime in the city at the time of the convention. So they had the bright idea of going to see Al Capone. And they told him how important it would be for Chicago not to have crime while the Canners were in town. And Capone said he understood the purpose of it, and it's certainly reasonable request, and he'd do what he could do to help out. And my dad said there wasn't a single holdup in the city of Chicago for the week the Canners were there. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but he told me that story on more than one occasion.
All right, so as you can see, organized crime of that time really ran the illegal alcohol prohibition, and as a result, there was a lot of violence and things that occurred, but it also kind of glamorized, again, the illegal drinking of that time, and so that's going to be one of the main reasons that's going to lead to prohibition's end. So the 5th question, how did prohibition end? The first bullet, drinking illegal alcohol. Drinking illegal alcohol became glamorous, Glamorous, and exciting. Became glamorous and exciting, semicolon. A new culture of the jazz age, Jazz, was created as a result. And so that's kind of the time period where, you know, people are enjoying this illegal alcohol. They're going to speakeasies. There's this, you know, sexual revolution, more gender equality. Also, there's going to be some more racial equality and just things like that. So it's kind of changing the course of history during the 1920s because of this. The second reason that Prohibition failed, so this is the second bullet, Prohibition failed to fully enforce sobriety, and cost the U.S. government billions of dollars to enforce. So not only was Prohibition unsuccessful in the fact that people weren't really following the laws and finding ways around it, but on top of it, they had to pay all these federal agents to be out destroying alcohol and doing all these things, and it was just ineffective as a whole. So, you know, for multiple reasons there, Prohibition was unsuccessful. And so finally then, this is the third bullet, in 1933, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, was passed, which ended Prohibition, and repealed, repealed, repealed the 18th Amendment. So basically, the 21st Amendment got rid of and null and void the 18th Amendment. So now Prohibition is over and alcohol is, you know, legal again, and people can consume alcohol as they please because they saw that this whole Prohibition movement was very unsuccessful at this time in our country's history. And so from there, they have to move forward. When you're finished getting your notes, you can go ahead and complete your Section 3 quiz.